Young people, pay close attention to this presentation. You will not hear it in school. You will not learn about this in school. It is very, very important. And I emphasize the young people because we need to start training the young people.
It's the story of how men and women of African descent helped save the Union and free themselves. When the Civil War begins in April of 1861, there are nearly 4 million Americans claimed as property held as slaves. 34 states in this Union. By the summer of 1861, 11 of those 15 slaveholding states had seceded from the Union, declared their independence from the United States, establishing as their capital Richmond, Virginia. In Washington that summer, Congress passed a resolution that stated why the federal government was going to war. It read, quote, to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union and not to overthrow or interfere with slavery, close quote. President Lincoln affirmed that resolution. President Lincoln had also called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the states with the purpose of preserving the Union. Men of African descent could not answer that call for volunteers because it was illegal for men of African descent to join the federal army. Congress had banned the enlistment of men of African descent in the federal army in 1792. President George Washington had signed the legislation into law. What was the reason? It was a reaction to the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791. It was being led by men of African descent who had been trained by the French army. Planters here in the United States, of which Washington was one, did not want to train their own African descent revolutionaries. So the reason he signed that legislation was not because they didn't make good soldiers, but it was a fear that they would make not only good soldiers, but good revolutionaries. When the Civil War begins, it is important to note that President Lincoln had no authority in the executive branch of government to abolish slavery or to arm men of African descent. He would need authority from Congress. There's a very good education we get recently in San Francisco when President Obama was speaking and a heckler called on him to lift, don't ask, don't tell. And the president very pedantically explained that he was in the executive branch of government and that Congress would have to take action. Congress makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the law. And President Lincoln did not believe that Congress would give him the authority to arm men of African descent until it became an indispensable military necessity. When did it become an indispensable military necessity? July 1862. Congress passed the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to arm men of African descent because it had become an indispensable military necessity. That legislation was on President Lincoln's desk for signature on July 17, 1862. Now there's another important piece of legislation that was on President Lincoln's desk that day. It is referred to as the Second Confiscation Act. In Section 6 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress gave the president the authority through the seizure of property to declare free all persons held as slaves in states in rebellion. The president was required to give the slaveholders in those states in rebellion at least a 60-day warning or notice of his intent to declare free their slaves. Also, in Section 9 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress freed all persons claimed as property by supporters of the rebellion who could make it to Union lines. President Lincoln signed both those pieces of legislation into law on the 17th of July, 1862. On the 22nd of July, 5 days later, he met with his cabinet. He informed his cabinet members that he was going to issue an emancipation proclamation immediately, acting acting on the authority that Congress had given him. He provided them a draft of his proclamation and asked for their advice. Secretary of State William Seward, an abolitionist out of New York, anti-slavery man, Harriet Tubman's benefactor, helped finance the Underground Railroad, advised President Lincoln not to issue the proclamation in July of 1862. Quote, "It will be viewed in the mind of the public as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching forth its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching forth their hands unto the government." Close quote. Secretary Seward went on to advise President Lincoln to wait for a military success, a victory on the battlefield, so that he might mask his cry for help to America's African descent community. President Lincoln called this advice from the Secretary of State wise advice. A prudent president takes wise advice. September 22nd, 1862, with his victory in hand, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in which he warned the states in rebellion that if they did not lay down their arms and return to the Union in the next 100 days, remember, he had to give them at least a 60-day notice. He gave them a 100-day notice. And if they did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, he was going to declare free their slaves. The rebels did not believe that Lincoln and the Union Army could make good this threat because they believed they were winning the war. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation as, quote, "a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion," close quote. I want you to notice the president's language. He did not say he was issuing it because it was the moral thing to do, because it was the right thing to do. He is explicit. He is issuing it because it is fit and necessary for what? For preserving the Union. And in this fit and necessary war measure, President Lincoln declared forever free all persons held as slaves in the 10 states that were at war with the United States for their independence. In the 5 slaveholding states that accepted Abraham Lincoln as their president, federal authority, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply because Congress did not give the president the authority to declare free slaves in states that were loyal to the Union, only in states in rebellion, in states that had to be brought back into the Union by military conquest. But even in those 10 states, there were exceptions to the proclamation. In Louisiana, the parishes around New Orleans, they were occupied by the Union Army, and 10% of the voters elected representatives to come to Washington. So as a consequence of meeting this qualification for returning to the Union, or having the intent to return to the Union, those parishes were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. In Virginia, where the capital of the Confederacy resided, the 48 counties that are now West Virginia became a state June 20th, 1863. And the counties around Norfolk and Hampton Roads, they were exempt from the proclamation. They could keep their slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to those states and designated areas of states that had to be brought back in the Union by military conquest. But if we recall, the Army needs help. In paragraph 6 of the Emancipation Proclamation is where President Lincoln issued the order to his field commanders to receive all men of African descent into armed services of the United States. This cry for help is so well matched, so well hidden, that in the 21st century, we still have many saying President Lincoln simply freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. No one was freed by a piece of paper. No one was freed by the word. They were freed by the deed. The Emancipation Proclamation was an agreement, an executive order that said to America's African descent population, thus saving the Union, then and only then are all persons held as slaves in those states forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free the slaves. It declares free slaves and gives a disenfranchised, enslaved population the authority to free themselves legally under the Constitution if they help save the Union. General Grant, quote, "By arming the Negro with the proclamation, we have added a powerful ally," close quote. I want you to notice the general's language. He didn't say by freeing the Negro with the proclamation. He said by arming the Negro with the proclamation. He didn't say we have more bodies. We have more bodies for the battlefield. That's not what he said. The general said we have added a powerful ally. He had Kobe Bryant, y'all. A difference maker on the battlefield. According to General Grant's order of battle, it is an indisputable historical fact that American soldiers of African descent captured and occupied the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Well documented in the official records, well documented in the newspapers of that day. One newspaper out of Washington, the National Republican, their headlines on April 4th, 1865 read, "Blacks capture Richmond." Pretty clear who captured Richmond. And throughout classrooms across this nation and in celebrations across this nation, we need to make sure that it is heard that they were freed by the deed and not by the word. Amen. Fellow Americans, we are celebrating a military victory. A military victory that makes it possible for us all in good faith in this country to pledge our allegiance to an indivisible republic. The freedom fighters that we honor fought to keep this one nation under God. With liberty and justice for all, they fought expressly to extend the blessings of liberty to all Americans, regardless of race, creed, color, or origin. We are celebrating on Juneteenth the victory of these freedom fighters that saved our country and put us on the path to the goals so clearly stated in the preamble of the Constitution. We weren't born in a perfect world, but because of dedicated men and women who sacrificed, we're here today with the opportunity to make this a more perfect union. Thank you.
People have heard that information.